hit agree if you want to, or you might even want to like turn off your camera or microphone if you don't want to be recorded.
No, I'm fine. I don't mind if you record it.
Cool. Yeah,
this will scandalize some people, I suppose, but probably not enough to get me no platformed at too many places anyway. So go ahead and record it.
All right. We are recording. And so welcome. This is our Romanelle Talk. We are hosting with Jeff McMahan. He's a White's Professor of Moral Philosophy at University of Oxford. And he's going to be giving us a short presentation. I couldn't remember, were you going to go for a full hour and then Q&A, or did you want to go to Q&A sooner than that? We're flexible how you would like to present today.
No, I think I would like to take my full hour and a half for the presentation, and we'll have about 5 minutes of Q&A after that. No, actually, I'm not sure how long I'll go. I was writing my notes today and they're not finished, and so I have no idea what's going to happen, but my guess is that I'll go for at least 45 minutes, if that's okay. I was unable to send a text in advance because there is no such thing.
All right, so feel free to go ahead.
All right. Well, so you've had now a warning, which is that I wrote all of these notes today under extreme pressure, and I haven't had a chance to read over them. So I mean, I won't try to deceive you. I have a little squished up Word document over at the side of the screen here that I'm going to be drawing on. These are notes that I wrote today. I'll see where I get. Some of it's going to be, especially at the beginning, what I'm going to say will be familiar to some of you, but not to everyone. So I'm going to rehearse some of this stuff that some of you have heard ad nauseum, just to set up the background to the original bits that I'm going to try to get in to the talk at some point. So I'll start off with some stuff that's familiar to some of you. Now, many people believe that we begin to exist at conception. I think that's a mistaken view. I believe that we begin to exist when the fetal organism acquires the capacity for consciousness, but I'm not going to argue for that here. In fact, I'm not going to argue for a lot of the stuff I'm saying at the beginning. These are just assumptions I'm making that I want to make explicit. But virtually everyone believes that we do begin to exist before birth, which is true on my view, except in the case of the most premature live births. And yet, the common intuition is that the death of a fetus is not a great misfortune for that fetus in the way that the death of an older child or adult is a misfortune for that person. And this is hard to explain, I think, if we accept the orthodox deprivation account of the badness of death, according to which death is bad because of what it deprives us of, and is bad to the extent of what it deprives us of. But if a fetus will be one and the same individual as the later person into whom it will develop, if it were to live, it seems to lose more good life in dying than it would by dying at any subsequent point in its life. Hence, on the standard deprivation account of the misfortune of death, the worst death seems to be death immediately after an individual begins to exist. But I take it that's implausible. That's not what people intuitively believe. Most people believe that spontaneous abortion or miscarriage is a greater misfortune for the parents than it is for the fetus, even when it occurs fairly late in pregnancy. So I want to supply an account of the misfortune of death that supports this common intuition, and on the view that I've argued for the degree to which a death is a misfortune is a function of two factors. The first is the amount of good life of which the individual who dies is deprived, and the second is the degree to which the individual at the time of death would have been psychologically connected to itself later in life at those times at which the good things in its life would have occurred. I also think that the strength of the reason that individuals have at any given time to take action to prevent themselves from dying at some later time depends on, first, the extent to which death would be a misfortune for them at the time at which it would occur, and secondly, the degree to which they would be psychologically related to themselves at that later time. That is, the extent of the psychological relations between them at a given time in their life and themselves later at the time at which they would die unless they take action to prevent that. Now, what the name that I gave to this understanding of the misfortune of death and of interests generally is the time relative interest account. And I, of course, don't expect anyone to accept this view, but I mention it and sketch it for you because I'm going to assume its truth for the purposes of my talk today. So what I'm doing today is to explore some of the implications of this view, and in particular, its implications for the wrongness of inflicting prenatal injury. Because even a conscious fetus would be psychologically related to itself at any time after birth by mere continuity of consciousness and not by any relations among the contents of consciousness, I think death is scarcely a misfortune for the fetus at all, despite the amount of good life of which it would be deprived. So I think death for a fetus, even if a conscious fetus that would be identical with a person later, suffers really no misfortune or only the most minimal misfortune in dying. And what that leads me to believe is that fetuses have only the most minimal interest in their future lives and only the most minimal interest in continuing to live and enjoying the goods of their future lives. And this explains why death would hardly be a misfortune for the fetus at all. Now, in my previous work, I've argued that this supports a permissive view of abortion. If we think in particular that there are no strong reasons not to have an abortion grounded in the moral status of a fetus, precisely because the fetus lacks the psychological capacities that are the bases of moral status. Again, on my view, the view is not obviously universally accepted. If the fetus lacks moral status and also is not harmed by being killed, then it looks like the objections to killing a fetus are quite weak. So, as I say, this view about the nature of fetal interests supports a permissive view of abortion, even during the later stages of pregnancy. But unfortunately, it also supports a permissive view of prenatal injury. And that's because just as the fetus has at most a minimal interest in continuing to live, so at most it has a minimal interest in avoiding prenatal injury, assuming that the infliction of the injury wouldn't cause pain to the fetus at the time, so that the bad effects would become manifest only much later in the life, at a time when the individual would be effectively unconnected with itself psychologically when it was a fetus. So prenatal injury is no more against the interests of the fetus the fetus at that time than abortion is. So I take it that this poses a challenge to my time relative interest account. I'm going to assume for the purposes of the talk that there is a strong reason not to cause prenatal injury to a fetus. And if the time relative interest account can't explain this, or more to the point, is actually incompatible with recognizing that there is such a reason, that is a strong reason not to inflict prenatal injury, then I think that counts very strongly against the time relative interest account. It's got to be compatible with and ideally explain why it's presumptively wrong to inflict prenatal injury. And let me digress for a minute. I've made this point in print, but I doubt if anybody has read the piece in which I make this point. I'm just going to digress to note that I think that the problem of prenatal injury is a challenge for other permissive views of abortion as well. For example, I think that the challenge deriving from prenatal injury is the strongest challenge I know of to Thompson's argument for the permissibility of abortion, which is probably the best known argument for abortion in all the literature. On Thompson's argument, as I'm sure you know, the fetus has no right to the use of the pregnant woman's body as a source of life support, and it's therefore permissible for her to expel it from her body. She wouldn't be depriving it of anything to which it has a right. But let's take a case in which a pregnant woman could satisfy her interests equally well by doing something that would merely injure a fetus rather than killing it. So she has a choice. She could either sacrifice her own interest, have an abortion, or do something that would satisfy her interests but cause prenatal injury to the fetus. Now, I think insofar as the fetus has any interest in its future life at all, it has an interest in having a life that's worth living rather than having no future life at all. So if anything, it's better for the fetus not to be killed, but just to be injured and go on to have a life that's worth living than not to have any life at all. If it would be better for the fetus to be injured rather than killed, and if both options would be equally good for the woman, her interest having already been satisfied, or her interest, let's assume, would be equally satisfied by both options, it seems that it would be not only permissible, but better for the woman to cause prenatal injury rather than to have an abortion. I mean, the way to think about this, I think, is to suppose that the injury would be, in effect, the cost that the fetus would have to pay in exchange for life support from the pregnant woman. And that's a cost that it rationally should be willing to pay if it could make rational choices. So it seems to me that in all those cases in which Thompson's argument justifies abortion, it also justifies the causation of prenatal injury. And that seems to me to be highly counterintuitive, and in my view, that undermines Thompson's argument. Okay, back to my own argument. My permissive view of abortion is challenged, I think, by prenatal injury, because it looks like my view may well imply that the same grounds for having a permissive view about abortion apply to the causation of prenatal injury. So here's a suggestion. This is something I've also noted in print in the past, but now think is insufficient. You could say that the only interest that's affected by abortion is a very weak interest in continuing to live that the fetus has. If it has an interest in continuing to live at all, it's just this very minimal weak interest. But prenatal injury will frustrate strong future interest, assuming that the injury will not kill the fetus, but just cause it some impairment. And indeed, the interests that will be frustrated by prenatal injury are not just the future interests of a fetus, but they will be the interests of a person at the time that they are frustrated later by the prior injury. That is to say, the fetus will have later interests, whether it has caused prenatal injury or not. We can, that's the normal assumption at any rate. And it seems that those future interests will be less well satisfied if prenatal injury is inflicted than if prenatal injury is not inflicted. But in the case of abortion, the fetus will have later interests only if the abortion is not performed. So there's an objection to prenatal injury that appeals to the effects of the injury on future interests, but there's no such objection to abortion. At least that's the claim. I think there's a lot to be said about this. First of all, it's not necessarily true that prenatal injury affects future interest or later interest. If a pregnant woman causes prenatal injury, the fetus may die nonetheless. It may suffer spontaneous abortion or miscarriage, or the woman may later decide to have an abortion. But whether the fetus will have later interests is at least independent of whether the pregnant woman causes prenatal injury. So what we can say is the interests that might be affected by prenatal injury are independent of whether the, let me put it a slightly different way. Assuming that the fetus will continue to live, the interests that will be affected by the infliction of prenatal injury are interests that the fetus will have, or they're interests that will exist. Well, let me put it this way. The fetus will have interest in the future that will be affected by the prenatal injury, irrespective of whether the prenatal injury is done or not. So prenatal injury will affect interests that the fetus will later have. That's not true in the case of abortion, if abortion is performed. But I think, again, it's worth pointing out that it's not that prenatal injury necessarily affects future interests. As I said a moment ago, the fetus may die, the woman may later have an abortion, the fetus may die in early infancy, whatever. It's not the case that there necessarily will be future interests that are affected by prenatal injury. Rather, what we should say is, at least this is a claim I've made in the past, that if the fetus has interests in the future, whether that fetus has interest in the future will be independent of whether the prenatal injury is inflicted, but whether a fetus will have interest in the future is not independent of whether an abortion will be performed. So abortion determines whether there will be future interest, prenatal injury does not. Now we could articulate this point by distinguishing between what I elsewhere refer to as independent interests, the existence of which is independent of whether some act is done, and on the other hand, dependent interests, the existence of which does depend on whether or not some act is done. So any interest that a fetus might have if an abortion is not performed are dependent interests with respect to the choice between having an abortion and not having an abortion. But so the claim is interests that a fetus will later have are independent relative to whether or not an act of prenatal injury is done. It's worth noting just here as a footnote that this distinction between dependent and independent interests is a distinction between interests that are always relativized to particular acts or choices. So an independent interest is always independent relative to some particular act of choice. Same with a dependent interest, its existence is always dependent on some particular act of choice. So that's the distinction. Now, one might claim that apart from any minimal present interests that might be affected, the interests that are affected by whether or not prenatal injury is inflicted are independent interests relative to whether the injury is inflicted, whereas the interests that might be affected by whether or not an abortion is performed are dependent interests relative to that choice, the choice between having an abortion and not having an abortion. Okay, so the infliction of here's the claim. The infliction of prenatal injury frustrates independent interests, whereas abortion merely prevents the existence and satisfaction of dependent interests. And one might try then to defend the time relative interest account by claiming that while independent interests are sources of moral reasons, dependent interests are not. And if that's correct, then it matters that prenatal injury will frustrate independent interests. This is rather like the crude claim that people made in the past that while future people matter, possible people don't. This was a claim that people made in population ethics a while back. I say it's crude, and actually what I'm saying now about interests is also rather crude, and I'll try to explain why. First of all, I think it's just clearly false that dependent interests are not sources of moral reasons. They clearly are the bases of moral reasons. Suppose I'm deliberating about whether to cause some person to exist whose life would be utterly miserable, a person whose life would not be worth living or below the neutral level for well-being. Now, if I were to cause that person to exist, that person would have interests, for example, in not experiencing suffering, and those interests would be by and large frustrated, because by stipulation, this person is going to have a miserable life. But those interests are dependent interests relative to my choice between causing this person to exist and not causing this person to exist. But clearly those interests are a source of a moral reason for me, namely a moral reason not to cause this person to exist, because I will be, in causing that person to exist, I will be causing important interests to exist that will be frustrated. And that seems clearly to give me reasons not to do that action. There are lots of possible views here that we could consider. One possibility is a view in population ethics that has been discussed from time to time called anti-frustrationism. This is the view that there's a reason to prevent the frustration of interests, but no reason to ensure the satisfaction of interests. And I think at first sight, this may not seem implausible, for in the case of existing interests, at any rate, preventing their frustration requires satisfying them, unless there's some independent option of simply eliminating them without frustrating them, which is rather hard to understand. And the interests, the implications of anti-frustrationism for creating new interests may seem to be just what we want, namely that there's a reason not to create any interests that would be frustrated, but no reason to create interests that would be satisfied. But I think this is really implausible in the case of existing persons. Existing people have a present interest both in not developing new interests that will be frustrated, and they have a present interest in developing new interests that would be satisfied. But even in the absence of any present interest, there does seem to be, in the case of existing persons, a reason to cultivate certain new interests. For example, in the case of small children, if there's a reasonable probability that new interest acquired by a child will be satisfied, others have a moral reason to try to induce the existence of those interests, even if the child doesn't have any pre-existing interest in the formation of new interests, precisely because it's a child and may be only loosely psychologically connected to itself in the future. Nevertheless, I think a better view than anti-frustrationism would be a view about the creation of interests that parallels the view about the creation of persons that seems to be the view of common sense. In the literature on population ethics, this is called the asymmetry, or sometimes the procreation asymmetry. What the asymmetry holds is that whereas there's always a reason not to cause a miserable person to exist, there's no reason to cause a well-off person to exist just because that person would be well off. We might think that there's a precisely parallel view about interests, which is namely there's a reason not to create interests through causing a person to exist if those interests would be frustrated. But there's no reason to create interest through causing a person to exist just because those interests would be satisfied. And maybe that's right. I'm skeptical of that because I'm skeptical of the negative claim in the procreation asymmetry, namely the claim that there's no reason to cause a well-off person to exist rather than not cause anyone to exist. I find that belief intuitive, but I have found too many objections to it to feel comfortable in claiming that it's true. I'll mention one of those objections a bit later on. But because the asymmetry in procreation ethics is intuitively plausible, the parallel view about interests is also prima facie plausible and constitutes, I think, a presumptive rebuttal of the claim that recognizing dependent interests as a source of moral reasons commits us to recognizing a reason not to perform an abortion or to cause a well-off person to exist rather than not to cause anyone to exist for that matter. Okay, so recognizing that we have moral reasons deriving from dependent interests doesn't seem to commit us to thinking that there's an objection to abortion if we can accept this claim of asymmetry between causing interest to exist that will be frustrated and causing interest to exist that would be satisfied. Okay. Okay, I'm going to, again, make the assumption for the purposes of the talk that the fetus, any fetus I'm discussing will live to become a person who will have a long life. And on this assumption, it may seem that the fetus's later interests that will be affected by whether the pregnant woman causes prenatal injury are what I have called independent interests relative to her choice of whether or not to cause the injury. But what I want to argue is that even that is false of many of the interests that the fetus will have. In other words, what I'm going to argue for here is the claim that a great many of the interests that would be affected by a woman's choice between causing prenatal injury and not causing prenatal injury are actually dependent interests in the relevant sense and not independent interests. And then the question, of course, is what's the significance of that? And I'll try to suggest that the significance is actually of some concern to us. Okay. Here's the problem. I've given this problem a label. I've discussed this phenomenon in the past. I'm certainly not the only person to have discussed this phenomenon. Among philosophers, my sense is that the earliest recognition of this phenomenon in its application to certain problems in philosophy was in a paper by Robert Merrihew Adams back in the 70s, I think, called Existence, Self-Interest, and the Problem of Evil. He was applying it to the problem of theodicy. I give it the label of the divergent lives problem. Here's how it applies in the case of prenatal injury. Okay, suppose a woman is pregnant with a fetus. She has some reason of self-interest to do what will cause it an injury that will have bad effects in the fetus's later life. Now, if she doesn't cause prenatal injury, the fetus's life will go one way. Its life will develop in a certain way. If she causes prenatal injury, that's going to affect the course that the fetus's life will take. Might have quite early and quite radical effects on the what happens in the fetus's subsequent life. And this is important because if the fetus's life develops in one way, say with prenatal injury, the fetus will develop certain particular interests. And if the fetus's life were to go a different way, perhaps because there wasn't any prenatal injury, that fetus would develop different interests. And that's because whatever interest the fetus develops are going to be interests that are concerned with, at least a lot of these interests are concerned with the particulars in that individual's life. So if the fetus's life goes one way, the individual who was once a fetus will develop certain particular attachments to particular people, develop certain special relationships with some people. It will develop interests in certain activities. It will develop certain ambitions and goals and form certain projects and so on. If its life goes differently, it will meet different people, develop different attachments to these people, and so on. And so the interests that the fetus will have, or the individual who was once a fetus will have in one possible life, will be concerned with, to some extent, those particular attachments and commitments and so on. If its life develops in a different way, it will have different interests concerned with different particular attachments and commitments and so on. So this is what I call the divergent lives problem. What it means is that many of the interests that a fetus will develop, depending on whether the pregnant woman chooses to cause prenatal injury or chooses not to cause prenatal injury, will be dependent interests relative to her choice between causing and not causing prenatal injury. In other words, a certain set of interests will exist if she does cause prenatal injury. A different set of interests will exist if she does not cause prenatal injury. And as I hope you recognize, those of you who are familiar with Parfit's work on population ethics, this is an analog for interests of the non-identity problem, which in Parfit's work applies to or is concerned with persons. So the non-identity problem arises in cases in which if one does a particular act, certain people will exist. But if one does another act, different people will exist. And in the cases that Parfit considers, acting one way will cause certain people to exist who will be less well off, whereas if one had acted a different way, different people would have existed who would have been better off. But, and here's the problem, this is why he calls it the non-identity problem, if one causes the less well-off, let's make it one person, if one causes the less well-off person to exist rather than a different, better-off person, that won't be, provided that the less well-off person has a life that's worth living, one's having caused that person to exist won't be bad for that person, it won't be worse for that person. Quite arguably, in my view, it won't have violated that person's rights. And indeed, it may, all things considered, be good for that person. So the problem is, what's the objection to causing the less well-off person to exist rather than the better-off person? You know, Derek thought the objection had, and when he wrote Reasons and Persons, Derek thought the objection had to be impersonal, or possibly it could be a wide reason, a wide person-affecting explanation. But I'm raising now a similar problem that applies to interests. Now, let me just mention this. There is, I mean, put it this way, the divergent lives problem, as I've sketched it for you, can arise in the life, and does always arise in the life of actually existing mature persons like ourselves. We make important choices. You make a choice to take a job at one university rather than take a job at a different university. That's going to affect which people you meet, which people become your friends, possibly which person you have children with. And if that's the case, it'll determine which children you have, determine important aspects of the future course of your life. And it may well be that, you know, when we reach one of these crossroads in our lives, we recognize that if we make one choice, our life will go better. If we make a different choice, our life will go less well. And here's another thing we might realize, that if we make the choice that causes our life to go less well, once we get far enough into that alternative life, that possible life, if that's the actual life and we get far enough into it, we can look at the better life we might have had and be glad that we've got the less good life that we have, precisely for the reasons that are at the foundations of the divergent lives problem. Namely, that if my life goes a certain way, I'm going to establish attachments to particulars, I'm going to make commitments and so on. And the interests that I will have in that actual life will be better satisfied in that life than they would have been in the objectively better life that I could have had I chosen differently and given myself the better life. That's not a problem, because at the time of choice, I always have a strong interest in choosing to have the better life rather than the less good life. So we can explain the reason that I have to choose the all things considered better life by reference to the interest that I have at the time of choice. But there isn't, when we get to the, when we're considering a fetus and the possible lives that are open to that fetus, and in particular, the life that a fetus will have if the pregnant woman causes prenatal injury, and the life that the fetus will have if the pregnant woman does not cause prenatal injury. The fetus has no interest in having the better life rather than less good life, or if it has such an interest, it's a very, very, very weak interest because of the reason I gave earlier. That is, its complete lack of psychological connection to either of these possible lives. And that's a foundational ingredient in its having interests in its own future. So what that means is there has to be a different basis for the reason to choose the better life rather than less good life in the case of a fetus facing the possibility of prenatal injury. Now, there are some subtleties here. Maybe I should mention one of them. In the case of a fetus faced with the prospect of prenatal injury, the pregnant woman is deciding whether to choose to inflict prenatal injury or not. In either possible life, or in all of the possible lives that the fetus might have, the fetus, that individual is going to have a strong interest in avoiding suffering. And it may well be true that that particular interest will be better satisfied in the life without the prenatal injury. On the other hand, it may well be that the prenatal injury wouldn't cause suffering. It would just reduce the benefits that the fetus would have, so that the life with the injury would be one with fewer benefits. The life without the injury would have more benefits. In that case, it might be true that at all times in the life of the fetus, if the woman does inflict prenatal injury, at all times within the life of the individual affected, that the interest that individual has in that life, in that trajectory for its life, will be better satisfied within that life than they would have been in the alternative life without the injury. Or it may well be that the interest that the individual has in the various particulars and commitments of the life it has with the prenatal injury outweigh the fact that its interest in avoiding suffering is less well satisfied in the life with the prenatal injury. So, let me summarize where I've got to here. Formally, the infliction of prenatal injury will be worse for the person into whom the fetus will develop. That seems to follow from the fact that the life with prenatal injury will be a less good life. But I think there are two facts, both of which I've mentioned, that make prenatal injury morally quite different from harming an existing person. These two facts are these. First, the fetus has either no present interest or only the weakest possible interest in having the better future without injury rather than the less good future with injury. And that's just because it doesn't have any interest in its future at all, given its psychological limitations. Second fact is that each of the two possible lives would be good for the individual from within that life. Whereas the alternative possible life would be less good from within the actual life. So you can imagine the fetus gets injured, has the less good life. As I've said before, the interests it has in that less good life may be consistently better satisfied from within that life than they would have been in the alternative life. So here's the conclusion that I want to draw from these two facts. There may be no time in her injured child's life when the interests that that child has in that life would have been better satisfied in the better life it would have had without the injury. And that's the way in which this divergent lives problem parallels the non-identity problem. And so if this is right, then I think the divergent lives problem in the case of a fetus, not in the case of a person, but in the case of a fetus, is really morally just like the non-identity problem. In that the choice between inflicting and not inflicting prenatal injury is not relevantly like a choice between harming a person and not harming that person. Rather, it's instead morally like a choice between causing a better off person to exist and causing a different, less well-off person to exist instead. Now, that's my main claim. I want to suggest it's illuminating in certain ways. One of the questions we might have, let's suppose a woman a pregnant woman does have an important reason to do what will cause prenatal injury. Let's just assume that's true. Let's assume if she doesn't cause prenatal injury, she herself will experience some fairly significant problem through the rest of her life, caused by the continuation of the pregnancy, but without taking whatever steps would eliminate the problem, but would also cause prenatal injury. So we want to ask in these cases, can the woman's own interests justify her in inflicting prenatal injury on the fetus she's carrying? Now, what I'm suggesting is the choice between prenatal injury and between causing prenatal injury and not causing prenatal injury is relevantly like the choice between causing a less well-off person to exist and causing a better off person to exist. We might helpfully or illuminatingly think about whether, what kind of reason-giving force the woman's interests have in the case of prenatal injury by asking, would her interests justify her in causing a less well-off person to exist rather than a different, better off person instead? This is like the paradigm cases of the non-identity problem. Parfit introduced the non-identity problem with the case of the 14-year-old girl. She wants to have a baby now. If she has a baby now, that child will be less well off because she won't be a very good parent. If she waits a few years and has a child in a few years, that's going to be less good, let's suppose, for the 14-year-old girl, but it will be better for the child that she will have at that time, but that will be a different child. So here, the questions in which the non-identity problem arises are often of the same form as the problem I'm suggesting now. We can ask whether a woman's own interests can justify her in causing a less well-off person to exist rather than a different, better off person. Now that question may be no easier to answer, but I think it helps us to understand better what's actually at issue in these cases. Now, I want to conclude with two more reflections, and at this point, I'm just throwing stuff out for us to discuss. One of the things that I'd like to discuss with you is this. What's the nature of the reason to cause a better off person to exist rather than a less well-off person? It can't be what Parfit calls a narrow person affecting reason. It could be an impersonal reason, as Parfit originally thought. It could be a wide person affecting reason. It could be what Johann Frick calls a standard regarding reason, but it's a peculiar reason because it's not concerned with harms or benefits to any particular person, nor with people's rights. At least I think it's not concerned with rights. So there's a question here. We recognize this reason, but what kind of reason is it? And perhaps even more importantly, how strong a reason is it? How strong can the reason be to cause a better off person to exist rather than a different, less well off person? And another problem about recognizing this reason and trying to determine its strength is that it seems to be in tension with another ground level common sense intuition about procreation, which is the second half of what I earlier referred to as the asymmetry, namely the claim that there's no reason to cause a well-off person to exist rather than not cause any person to exist. Here's the problem. If there's a reason to cause a well-off person to exist rather than cause or allow a less well-off person to exist, how can there be no reason to cause a well-off person, perhaps even the same well-off person, to exist when the alternative is that no new person will come into existence? Why does what the alternative is make all the difference to whether or not we have that moral reason to cause a well-off person to exist? On the face of it, it might even look like the reason that we have to cause a well-off person to exist rather than a less well-off person is that we have some reason to prevent the existence of a less well-off person. But of course, that doesn't seem at all plausible. So how can we reconcile these two beliefs? And if they are difficult to reconcile, how does that bear on the reasons that we have not to inflict prenatal injury? Which of the reasons should we give up? Should we give up the reason? Should we give up the idea that we have strong reason to cause a better off person to exist rather than a less well off person? Or should we give up the common sense belief that we have no reason to cause a well off person to exist rather than not cause anybody to exist? I'm assuming you see the tension between these two beliefs. You know, whether we have a reason to cause a well-off person to exist depends on whether the alternative is a less well-off but still well-off person will exist, or whether the alternative is that no person will exist. How can that be so decisive? Okay, let me leave you with one further question. Let's suppose that in pursuit of her own interests, legitimate interests, a pregnant woman has inflicted prenatal injury on her fetus that will cause that fetus's life to be less good than it would have been, though it will still be worth living. Given that she has caused the prenatal injury, does she then have a moral reason to have an abortion? When I wrote about this in the past, I think, and in particular in the paper that I sent along called Paradoxes of Abortion and Prenatal Injury, I don't know whether any of you took a look at that paper. I'm afraid I didn't have time to, so I can't remember much of what I said in it. But I think what I said in that paper was that once a woman's own interests have been satisfied by her having inflicted prenatal injury on her fetus, the only interests that remain at stake are those of the fetus. And I've claimed that the fetus doesn't have strong interests at all, but insofar as it has any interest, it seems to me that it has an interest in having a life that's worth living rather than having no future life at all. So once a pregnant woman has caused prenatal injury, I thought, doesn't seem like she has any moral reason to have an abortion. Rather, it looks like she may have a very weak, at least, moral reason not to have an abortion. So abortion is not a remedy or a repair for prenatal injury. At least that's what I claimed. But I now think that because the fetus really has no psychological connections to itself in the future, it is effectively what Peter Singer called replaceable. morally replaceable. That is, it seems to me that fetuses, even fetuses with rudimentary consciousness, don't matter in themselves. They don't have moral status, although the content of their mental lives matters morally. I'm assuming that a fetus, a conscious fetus, I'm assuming can feel pain and feel it as aversive. And so certainly one has reason not to cause that. But it seems to me that once, precisely because I think a fetus has no significant moral status, and because it's not harmed by being killed because it has no significant interest in continuing to live, there actually is a moral reason for the woman to have an abortion and conceive another child who won't be injured if that's possible. So that this too is morally like a choice between allowing a less well-off individual to come into existence and causing a different, better off individual to come into existence. So I'm saying there's this phenomenon that we find in non-identity problem cases, namely we have a choice between causing a better off individual to exist and causing a less well-off individual to exist. And I'm saying both prenatal injury and abortion are relevantly like these choices in non-identity problem cases. That's it. Thanks for
All
bearing
right.
with me. I think that was less than an hour, but leaves us plenty of time to have discussion and then have a drink.
Yeah. Let's take a like a 5-10 minute break for before we go to Q&A. Let's still thank our speaker for this talk. So we'll reconvene at Eastern Standard Time. It would be or Eastern Daylight Time. It would be 4:10. That sounds good. I don't know what's the time difference for you? Is it 5 hours or?
Yeah, it's just 5 hours. This is nothing. Last Thursday and Friday, I gave talks in San Diego. So I gave them from midnight until 2 a.m. both nights. I got to do that again in Australia in a couple of months too. So this is piece of cake. Yeah. 9 o'clock. Right. Okay. See you in a minute.
Yep.
I'm going to, if you see me looking down, I'm going to probably make notes through the discussion so that because I have a memory, that's unparalleled in its badness. And so if I don't write it down, I won't remember it, but I'm sure I'll learn some stuff. So if I'm looking down and saying, wait a minute, it's because I'm trying to make some notes from the discussion.
All right. Yeah, so we're in our Q&A. If you're unfamiliar with Zoom, there's a reaction button for raising your hand, or you could also say in the chat that you have a question and I'll add you to the queue. If you can avoid it, try to avoid two-part questions. Try to frame it as just one. We can add you back to the queue. There should be, I think, plenty of time. We'll start with Steve Kirshner because he preempted everybody else raising their hands, and we'll begin there, and I'll add everybody else to the list.
So, Jeff, fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it as always.
Thank you.
My question has to do with permissibility, and in discussing whether or not you can kill a fetus, you seem to put it in terms of the fetus's interests rather in terms of rights. I'm wondering if that's correct. And here's my concern. You might think that, imagine someone an old man does not have a life worth living, but wants to live. It seems that it's pretty wrong to kill that person, even though he does not have a life that's worth living. Similarly, if someone has a life that's well worth living, but wishes to die and consents to dying, you might think there's no wrong making if you kill the person. You might think that you have a right to make your life go less well. And you might think you have a right to, even if you're worried about second order interest in choices or autonomy, that you have rights that diminish or eliminate that. So I'm wondering why you focus on interest in terms of permissibility rather than rights. It would seem that the more natural approach would be to focus on rights. So, thank you.
Okay, yeah. I did, as an aside at one point, claim that an individual like a fetus that is unconnected psychologically to itself in the past or in the future, this kind of isolated sentience in the moment, is an individual that, in my view, doesn't matter for its own sake. It doesn't matter in itself. And another way of putting that is I think it doesn't have moral status. That's compatible with thinking that, as I said, the contents of its experiences or the contents of its experience matter. But insofar as it doesn't have any kind of life that's relevantly unified from one moment to the next, it's not a morally important subject. So that's a claim about its lack of moral status by reference to its lack of psychological capacities. And so what I'm saying is, to couch my claim in the language of rights, individuals that are unconnected with themselves in the past and in the future in the relevant ways just don't have rights. And they don't matter. They are, as Peter, excuse me one sec. As Singer puts it, they're replaceable. It doesn't matter if one fetus just were to vanish and be replaced by a qualitatively identical fetus, nothing that is of moral importance would have changed. Of course, but if one person goes out of existence, even if that person is replaced by a perfect replica, I think something really terrible has happened. And that's because the original person really matters and is not replaceable. It's that person is a unique individual with connections to him or herself in the past and in the future.
But just a quick, so again, great point. But if that were right, then why do we need this complex analysis? I mean, the fetus has no rights. Rights are what are the rightness and wrongness maker here. End of story. You can do what you want to your fetus, just like you can do what you want to your car. And in addition, your argument would apply equally to infants. I doubt they have any more psychological coherence than do fetuses. You might think, well, look, it's okay to, the fetus, that infants lack status as well. It's okay to kill them. But I guess my first question is, why then go through the complexity? I mean, if fetuses have no rights in virtue of having no status, it's a real quick argument as to, can we kill them or can we cause them injury? We can do whatever we want to them.
Well, as I suggested, I accept the implication in the case of abortion. I think no significant harm is done, no significant misfortune is caused, nor is there offense to any kind of moral status. But prenatal injury seems different in that it's done to a fetus, but it looks like it causes harm to a person later on. So even if the fetus itself doesn't have rights, we might think prenatal injury violates the rights of the later person. That might be true. On the other hand, it would be one of these curious cases in which the violation of a right might be worse for a person based on the effect that it has on the person's life as a whole, but what actually happens to the person within the outcome in which the right is violated is at all times in the interest of the person in that outcome. That may still be that the claim about rights works in the case of prenatal injury. I didn't go into that. But again, it would have to be the rights of the later person, and then we'd have this particular paradox. I mean, I agree that one can often violate a person's right by doing something that's better for that person. And in some ways, successful paternalism is always of that sort.
Thanks.
All right. Next, we've got Jim Delaney.
Thanks. Jeff, Jim Delaney, and I don't know if we've met before, but thanks a lot for the talk. So I guess, Jonathan, this is sort of a two-part question, but I promise it'll be quick. So the first part is just kind of a clarification on your view of personal identity. So I take it that, prior to there being a person, when the rudimentary psychological activity starts, then that's the beginnings of a person. And then, so it seems like certain things could be numerically identity affecting on your view, depending on what. So prior to the person coming into existence, could you do something to the embryo or the fetus that would make it not just like the non-identity problem, but like a non-identity problem kind of case? And so before, kind of the beginning of the talk, I was thinking about this. And so I guess I'm wondering, in those cases, do you see it as an even worse sort of tension, or is it sort of does it seem like a worse kind of problem about there's no harm because it's not the same person than the case you have in mind, where I take it it's numerically identical, but the interests are so different? So would you want to make it just, are those sorts of cases possible? Do I have your view right on identity? And if they are, how do you kind of put those cases along the ones you're talking about today?
Well, tell me if this helps. On certain views, including my own, we begin to exist a certain way into pregnancy. So at one point, there's a human organism that doesn't support the existence of somebody like you or me. Later, it does support the existence of somebody like you or me. I think that there could be prenatal injury to an embryo or a fetus prior to one of us coming into existence that would be what I call identity determining. That is, without the injury, one individual will come into existence. With the injury, a completely different person will come.
Yeah, that's exactly the case I have in mind. There could be such cases, you think?
Yeah, I think that there can be such cases. So those are just straightforward non-identity problem cases, but they're before somebody begins to exist. So that's easy. So what I'm claiming is, I think after one of us begins to exist, it's very difficult, probably impossible to imagine a form of injury to the fetus that would make the difference, that would cause one individual to cease to exist and bring a different individual into existence instead.
Yeah, so I guess I haven't, I meant so take the straightforward non-identity case, A doesn't come, instead of A coming into existence, the injury causes B to come into existence with this injury, as opposed to the case you were talking about today, where A comes into existence with the injury versus A without the injury, and their interests are just very different. So one is still the same person sort of choice. And I guess morally, are those the same in terms of whatever complaints, the person says, hey, I wish you wouldn't have smoked or whatever, or done this thing. And then in the non-identity case, you say, well, if I hadn't done that, you wouldn't be here, somebody else would.
Yeah.
Would we have the same kind of response in your cases where it's identity preserving? Well, you'd be here, but you'd be so incredibly different that would you say morally those kinds of cases are on par in terms of how we would treat complaints and things like that?
Yeah, thank you. I probably should have made precisely that point. Yes, that in a way, that's the point. Injuries before one of us comes into existence can be identity determining because they affect the conditions of the origin of a person in Kripkean terms. I've been inclined to think injury caused to a fetus after one of us comes into existence harms the individual who will develop from that fetus because that individual already exists. And these are just different possible futures of one and the same individual. So the contribution I'm trying to make in the talk today is that because of the divergent lives problem, these cases in which a prenatal injury determines the course that the individual's life will take are morally relevantly more or less just like the identity determining cases of injury prior to the coming into existence of somebody like you or me.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'll shut up. But like, I guess I have a slightly different intuition. I might take the same person complaint a little more seriously, but it's just an intuition. Thanks again for the talk. It's really great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to take the same person intuition seriously, and that's because these are cases that formally, it is the same individual, and it is worse for this individual in a particular sense to have a less good life. It's one and the same individual who has a less good life rather than a better life. And so that's got to be worse for that individual. What I'm saying is, though, that if you look at the problem not in terms of, let's say, the overall value of the life as a whole, but by reference to the interests that
Right.
that individual has at any given time, we can't explain that.
Right.
And that's because the fetus is what I call an psychologically unconnected individual. And my view, maybe I should have said this. Maybe this will help. This is part of the view that on the view that I hold, the death of an individual immediately after or shortly after that individual comes into existence is in substance no different from that individual's never coming into existence. So you could think of it this way. Suppose you think we begin to exist at conception with the fusion of the sperm and the egg. My view would be that the death of a single-celled zygote is in substance absolutely no different from the failure to join together of the sperm and the egg. And I think something like that is true on any account of the beginnings of our existence that implies that we begin to exist prior to birth.
Thanks.
All right, next we've got Hershanov, then Travis Thurman.
Hi, Jeff. I actually am sympathetic to a version of time relative interest account of harm, but I want to see what you say about this sort of, how you explain away this sort of anomalous problem. And that is, inspired by these sort of Williams-Unger future pain prudential concern tests, where you're told your mind's going to be white clean and you're going to be very childlike and then tortured. And we seem to want to take on a lot of pain to avoid that post mind wipe claim or mind wipe torture. And there's no psychological continuity. So it seems like you have to say that we're sort of wrong to think that, because it's almost as you and Parfit would say, like another person. But alternatively, it could be that pain actually shows that psychological continuity has been distorting us and distracting us. And here's some supporting evidence for that, is when I tell people to imagine a brain zap that leaves them childlike, infant-like, they seem to be able to identify with that more than if I tell them that their brain's unwired and then rewired in another personality. Then they have a harder time identifying and caring about the brain wipe and rewiring. And psychological discontinuity seems to get in the way there, or the new psychology seems to be distracting them when they're equally discontinuous in both cases, where the wipe that leaves them childlike and the wipe that leaves them like your cure type of thought experiment. So I'm wondering what you would say about that. And then in one of the papers you sent us, I think you're trying to support time relative interest account. Wasn't clear. With Parfit's Young Socialist and Dworkin's critical interest and experiential interest, I'm worried with the Young Socialist that it's a temporally neutral moral concern, because if you reverse it, make them profligate or dissolute, I'm not really sure what those words mean. They're like SAT words I knew a long time ago, but I know they're negative, anti-idealistic. There it's not as clear that we think it's reasonable to bind yourself. So it may be these temporally neutral moral reasons. And then the time relative interest account, I don't think is helped by Dworkin, because Dworkin thinks these critical interests survive. And on a time relative interest account, these are idiosyncratic. When your brain's damaged by dementia, these interests and dignity and so forth should go on. But Dworkin's intellectual is rather hostile to his impaired self. He wants him dead. It's degrading. While on a time relative interest cell, you should be really indifferent to your demented self. It's almost like another person. So I don't think they actually help that much. But anyway, I'm more curious, what do you think about the sort of Williams-Parfit future pain prudential concern tests seem to say about the importance of psychological continuity in terms of what matters to us?
Okay, yeah, I confess I feel a pull about that. That is to say, if somebody tells me all the contents of my mind are going to be obliterated, and I'm just going to be in the future, I'll be what I call an unconnected individual, just a sort of locus of consciousness, a place where conscious experiences occur, but they're completely unconnected from moment to moment. But in that consciousness, there's going to be a lot of terrible suffering that's going to be aversive. It'll just be sort of physical suffering. I agree that I would be strongly tempted to accept lesser suffering now to prevent the greater suffering after the mind wipe. On the other hand, what that suggests to me is that there is some basis for egoistic concern just in bare continuity of consciousness and, in effect, the persistence of the capacity for consciousness, or that one basic psychological capacity, the capacity for consciousness in the experience of suffering. That in itself is one form of continuity that's present in this case. As you'll point out, it's also present in the case of fetus. I wonder if it makes a difference, though, that the fetus starts out with nothing, whereas if I'm contemplating, should I accept this pain, I'm starting out with a lot, which I know is going to be erased, but the consciousness is still going to be continuous with that which I have at the moment.
I mean, it could be that starting where we are now, it's distorting us. But I'm trying to raise the possibility that what's misleading us is continuity. And we see that in people's different attitudes to the wipe and rewiring as to just the unwiring. I still think there's something, you can run a prudential pain test with less pain, because, great pain is really independent of continuity. If you do it like your cure, say you're just going to have, I think this shows that psychological continuity still matters. It's just not the whole story. And I think we can then harm these fetuses more than you are saying. But we could do something like your cure. Imagine lesser pain that's going to leave you like flu-like symptoms where you got headaches and fatigue and you can't pursue your intellectual projects. And then imagine how much pain you would take on to avoid that flu-like thing so you could pursue your intellectual project. And then do it like the cure, same sort of fatigue and headaches, but it's going to be completely new projects, equally valuable or more. You're not going to take on as much pain. So, I still think there's something to time relative interest, but I do think the pain case is pretty anomalous, and we're willing to take on a lot that we won't for others. And I could go on. I got a bigger story about how the interest we have. I think we have interest in, even when we're mindless, in like health, say attachments, and they get filled out in a determinable way. And I play a time relative interest story to that. So I'll have fetuses suffering great harms because they have these other interests. But anyway, I just wanted to see what you would say about the younger Williams type, which seems to elicit a great deal of concern. And maybe pain is exceptional, or maybe great pain is distortional. But I tend to think psychological continuity can make us imprudent. And you see that when you have a different attitude to torture after wipe as torture after wipe and replacement. That's just imprudence, in my view. You're equally psychologically discontinuous and you should react the same. You shouldn't care more in a prudential sense about being infant-like than being like after the cure, where you're adult-like, but like someone else. There's no psychological continuity in either case. I just think psychological continuity is distracting us from what matters in this case.
I'm not sure, because it seems to me that when we imagine becoming childlike, we think something is retained. It's either like a familiar case of dementia, or people imagine it as reverting to the way they were when they were a child. And in both those cases, there's a lot that's preserved, whereas with a wipe, there's nothing preserved. And with the remaking, there's both a wipe and a construction of a new personality. Now, I agree with you. There should be no difference. I mean, what you're calling the mind wipe is total psychological discontinuity. There's nothing,
everything idiosyncratic, yeah.
There's no further discontinuity added when you reprogram in a new personality or something. So I think,
but it distracts us and we care less about it, is my point.
Okay.
Yeah. All along, psychological continuity could be a cause of imprudence. And anyway, I've talked enough. Yeah.
Okay, but that was helpful. I agree with your point about the Russian nobleman, that our intuitions are influenced by whether the change is a corruption or an improvement. But I think what we should see there is that it's entirely possible for corruptions of character and improvements of character to be equal instances of psychological discontinuity. But what we should think is that both are impairments of the basis for egoistic concern, but we may be willing to make trade-offs with something even that fundamental if we get an improvement in moral character. We certainly wouldn't make the trade-off for a corruption of moral character.
Yeah, I forgot what you said in Ethics of Killing about Dworkin, but I think the person should not be concerned about the indignities of the dementia, because I think the critical interests are gone. They're contingent. They're like being a Yankee fan. You can wipe me clean and make me a Red Sox fan. So I think that's a case where you should not care about the death, because that's not an indignity to you. That's, as you and Parfit say, that's like someone else. So I didn't know if you were in this other paper that you sent us, we're trying to use that to support time relative interest. It seems to me to be at odds with time relative interest. You shouldn't be hostile to that person and want him dead, because it's almost like it's almost like it's someone else.
What I think I have to say consistently about that is that even into contented dementia, there are some psychological connections or overlapping chains of connection between myself pre-dementia and my badly demented self that warrant my having concern for this later individual of an egoistic sort, because that will be me, and there is some basis for egoistic concern, but my concern about the indignity should be weaker than my concern about other forms of indignity that I might experience at other times when I'm much more closely psychologically.
Yeah, I think your concern should be for the experiential interests. Yeah. And I mean, you may have some other view about the value of a whole life and integrity. I mean, because time relative interest isn't your whole story on these things. All right, I've abused my role as director.
No, those were all good questions. Thank you for them. I've made a note of all of them.
As an assistant, I couldn't hold him back. So we've got Travis and then John Leza.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm interested in the parallels between the divergent lives problem and the non-identity problem. Perhaps my theory-laden judgments are such that in non-identity cases, it's permissible to bring about the suboptimal outcome to create some, the less happy person. But I don't have similar judgments about the divergent lives problem. And I in wondering whether the time relative interest account can accommodate this judgment, or if the reason that I want to treat them differently might require rejecting the time relative interest account. Okay, so take a non-identity case that's unlike parfits, where it's not a 14-year-old girl, because I think people's concerns about prudential considerations might be muddying the waters there. But just imagine a case in which a woman could create two people whose lives are very happy and well worth living, but if she acts on her interest to have a child later rather than sooner, then the different person that would come into existence would be less happy than the one that she would have if she had a child earlier and sacrificed her interest, even though she's an adult with a career and all of that. And the difference in happiness that she gains from waiting is less than the difference between the two possible people that she could create. That seems perfectly permissible to me. But I don't have similar judgments about a woman causing a prenatal injury to make a greater difference to the net welfare of the child that she would create if numerical identity is maintained. Even under the assumption that the child would have a reasonable attachment to the actual if she causes the prenatal injury and gives them a less happy life. In cases in which the difference that she causes the child in their total well-being is greater than the difference in welfare that she gains by causing the prenatal injury. Okay, so maybe my reason that I want to treat these differently stems from a concern about an implication of the time relative interest account. And here's that concern. Imagine a case where someone has an independent interest in avoiding suffering. So someone's about to come into existence. Maybe they're a zygote now, and they're distinct from the person that the zygote's going to turn into. And you, a third party, can do one of two things. You can either push button A, that's going to reduce but not completely alleviate the suffering. Or sorry, no, let me revise that case. I'm sorry. Imagine a toddler that lacks personhood. So it's an independent interest in avoiding suffering. You as a third party can do one of two things. You can push button A, that'll reduce but not eliminate the suffering that it endures, or you can push button B, where that does not change the total amount of suffering that they'll endure, but it does change the degree to which they'll be psychologically connected to their future selves. It seems like the time relative interest account is going to entail that what would be best for the toddler at that time, in some cases, if you change the degree of psychological connectedness enough, is to push button B, even though that's subjected them to a life with a lower total well-being level. Okay, so that seems like
I've got some questions. Let me.
Yeah.
I'm not clear about the example. You said it's a toddler. Normally, I think of if something toddles, it walks. I think, and anything that walks is going to be self-conscious to some degree and have interests in its own future. And my cases are cases involving fetuses in which there's no present interest, and we're just thinking about. You were saying that this is an independent interest that it has in avoiding suffering, but it looks to me like an actual existing interest, not some future interest, in not having the pain when the pain is occurring, but it looks like an existing interest now in avoiding pain in the future.
Yeah.
And then also the other thing I don't understand about the case is whether the alteration in psychological continuity is for the worse or for the better. That is, say, if I take action, am I going to be diminishing psychological unity between different times in the life, or am I going to be increasing it? So can I get you to kind of reformulate the thought experiment or the case so that I can understand better what's going on?
Yeah, good. Sorry. So suppose that it is a current interest in avoiding suffering, and that the change in psychological continuity is going to diminish the psychological continuity. So there'll be less psychological continuity between the toddler at present and the future person that it'll turn The thought was if you diminish the psychological continuity enough, then they would have a lesser interest thwarted than if you don't diminish the psychological continuity but reduce the future suffering that they would endure to some degree. So that's the case. Now, here's a thought that I have that maybe is hopefully helpful. Perhaps, so my worry is that the time relative interest account would say that what you should do as a third party is diminish the psychological continuity so that a smaller interest is thwarted. That seems wrong to me. But maybe the time relative interest account could be supplemented with some moral principle that just says, in these sorts of cases, what you ought to do is perform the act that's going to make the biggest difference to the creature's total well-being, sort of independent of what their current interest is. And if that's the case, if that moral principle is consistent with the time relative interest account, then that might also explain divergent intuitions in the divergent lives problem and compared to a non-identity problem. Because that principle wouldn't apply in non-identity cases, but it would apply in divergent lives cases. That's the thought.
Okay. I have two thoughts, but I'm having trouble kind of grappling with all of this. But let me try out two initial responses. One is that each individual who already has some kind of psychological connections to the future, to his or her future selves, is going to have an interest in, at a minimum, maintaining that degree of psychological relatedness to the future, and probably in increasing it, because it is the condition of having anything good in the future for oneself that counts as one's own good in the future. So I'm now, well, what I'm going to say now is connected with what I said about this case that David referred to a couple of times, called the cure. If you were to say to me, don't worry, I'm going to make sure your future life is really, really good, but I'm going to sever psychological continuity between yourself now and yourself in the future, to me, that would be relevantly like you're killing me. So I just think we have this strong present interest in maintaining at least the degree of psychological relatedness to the future that we already have, and arguably to increasing it as well. Certainly, it's against my present interests to lose the bases of the basis of my rational anticipation of good things in the future. Second point is, what was it? Yeah, in these same individual cases, if we just sort of give up thinking about interests and think, okay, what's going to give the best total amount of well-being in the life? I think you were suggesting something like that. Then we have to grapple with the problem with which I began, namely, why isn't death immediately after an individual begins to exist as an embryo or a fetus the worst possible death? Because that makes the life, that gives the life the least possible well-being it could have. And just secondly and secondarily, not only would it, kind of help you and help the rest of us, I suppose, support our intuition about prenatal injury despite the divergent lives problem, but would also, I think, reintroduce the idea that we have a very strong reason not to have an abortion, because that'd be the choice for the fetus would be between a life with a lot of well-being and a life with no further well-being. So if you think that a permissive view about abortion is correct, then you have a reason to worry about that.
Yeah, if I'm do really brief follow-up, right, in the cure case, there's complete retrograde amnesia. So, I mean, I agree about what's intuitive in that case, but I was thinking just a diminishment, but not a eradication of psychological connectedness. And there could be a degree of diminishment that would make it such that the interest that's being thwarted by enduring a greater amount of pain is a lesser interest than not diminishing the psychological connectedness, not eradicating it, not diminishing it at all, and just reducing the pain a little bit. And I do want to accept a permissive view of abortion. What I want to say about the types of cases that you're concerned with is that for the being, it is a prudentially, extrinsically worse outcome to die the moment you come into existence, assuming that means that you'll be deprived of more net good life than if you die, say, as a teenager. But that the tragedy tracks the type of creature that is being killed. So in virtue of a fetus having a lower moral status, it's not as tragic or bad from an impartial view to do something that's worse for a fetus than it is to do something that's less bad for a person. That has its own problems, but that's how I do want to avoid that conclusion, and that's how I try to do it.
Yeah, I think I'll just register my view that I think it's, when we're trying to explain the misfortune of death, it's better to be able to give that explanation in terms of something that explains how the misfortune itself is lesser, rather than that the misfortune matters less because the individual who suffers it has lower moral status. The kind of view you were gesturing towards, I think, is the kind of view that Liz Harman has always been attracted to. And I don't find it at all appealing, because death is not some sort of affront to the respect that I'm due as a being with moral status. It's a non-moral bad thing to die. It's not that there's something morally bad about me dying. The question is bad for me, and that seems to be unaffected by moral status. So, for example, I've thought about this a bit, and I'm inclined to take a different view, but I've actually written a paper about this that will be published eventually. It's coming out in a book. I wrote it ages ago. David DeGrazia and Peter Singer think the degree to which an individual's suffering matters morally is independent of that individual's moral status. But even then, that's how it matters morally, and not how bad it is for that individual. And I guess one more thing, and then we'll go to the next question. I do just see psychological continuity, psychological relatedness over time as a matter of degree. And so total brain wipe or whatever is like my ceasing to exist. It's the end of everything I rationally care about for myself. But smaller reductions in psychological relatedness still matter, even when they're smaller. And your question is, this is a really interesting question. And I don't have any kind of formula or algorithm here. You're raising the question: how could we trade off, let's say, increases in well-being against diminution of psychological relatedness. So would I accept some diminished psychological relatedness to myself in the future for a higher quality of life in the future? Quite possibly with very small reductions in psychological relatedness, it would be rational for me to do that. But the more I lose, the closer I get to just having no basis for caring about what happens in the future at all, apart from whatever basis there might be in just pure continuity of consciousness, that is, consciousness being generated by one in the same brain or one in the same substrate without any kind of connections, which is part of my answer to what David was saying about Williams' undertaking.
All right, John Lisa.
Hi, Jeff. Long time. Nice to see you. And
Helsinki or something?
sorry. Yes, Helsinki, I think was last time. A very interesting talk. And I'm going to sort of violate Jonathan's rules because I don't have a very clear question. Just some scattered thoughts, I suppose. But I'm sort of interested in, when we're dealing with this issue about what the woman should do. So it's not. I'm sort of in general interested in what's going on outside of the mother, like external kinds of factors that might bear on the morality of the decisions, and it's also connected with maybe thinking about how we assess interests. Or what interests it makes sense to attribute to individuals. So I'm sort of concerned about, let's say, thinking about miscarriage, for example. I think with miscarriage, a lot of times people may not think it is such a tragedy because they think, well, that it wasn't, the fetus or the embryo, it just wasn't to be. I mean, that it didn't have the wherewithal to develop in a way that it would have any kind of interest. It was just, and so there seems to be some assumptions about realistic possibility in order to attribute interests to individuals, and in particular a fetus. And so if it didn't have the physiological stuff that would enable it, this genetic to move forward, then I'm not sure it makes sense to attribute interest to it. But then, of course, what could affect the possibility of it moving forward could be something external to it. It doesn't have some necessary external conditions. And then it seems to me that you could have decisions that people make, whether individual decisions or social laws allowing certain practices or disallowing certain practices that would also bear on the possibilities for the development of the individual. And so, and that would seem to impact on our sort of understanding of what interests the individual might have. So, I guess I'm just, when we start to think about these divergent lives, I'm sort of interested in what else is going on besides, on those lives and impacting on the decision, because you could see maybe, in one case, the mother might be justified in inflicting the prenatal injury because of other things, other factors that may be present or likely to be present in the case in terms of the welfare of that, of herself and also of the fetus. And in other cases, it wouldn't be justified because of the external factors would be different. So I'm not sure, it's not much of a question, but I'm just sure, I mean, to what extent do you think that these external kinds of factors would bear on the issues that you've raised?
I think I detect two kind of points there in violation of Jonathan's protocols, but I mean, one had to do with, well, the second one was external considerations. And I'm not sure exactly where you were going with that, but obviously, I mean, I do think that lots and lots of considerations can, bear on these questions about whether it's permissible to cause prenatal injury. And I was trying to narrow the scope of the discussion to questions about interests, really, and how those are related to overall good and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure what to say about that, but I did want to say, you began by saying, in the case of miscarriage, we often think, well, there's no scope for real tragedy there because the fetus simply didn't have the physiological wherewithal to survive. It was obviously defective fetus, that, this was the natural process of eliminating a fetus that didn't really have the potential to live, or something like that. Is that?
Yeah, and then it makes sense to think it's deprived of a future of value.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot here depends on the which counterfactual comparisons it's acceptable to make, and we could say, in the case of a fetus that miscarries, what a misfortune! Its misfortune was overdetermined. Not only did it die, but it didn't even really have the wherewithal to survive. So think about, I mean, what I'm saying is, not having the wherewithal to survive could be considered in itself a misfortune, if we think that there really is some kind of subject there that in principle could be a subject of real misfortune. And we can see that when we think of, let's say, an adult whose genetic constitution is such that there is an inbuilt, non-reversible limitation to lifespan, say at age 30. This is a person who simply cannot live beyond 30 because, there's, you could even think of, I think, there's this condition called progeria, I think, in which aging occurs very rapidly and very early in life, and these people never live beyond about 10 or 15 years old. And when they die, they're very, very aged. If that's a genetic condition, and I don't know anything about it, it may not be, but if it's an inbuilt genetic condition, then these people are sort of doomed to age prematurely and die in their teenage years. So they don't have the wherewithal physiologically to become adults, but we think that they are victims of a really terrible misfortune.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's, if you're dealing with the question at the beginning of life, whether, what the what are we talking about, a possible person or a potential person? And that may make a difference. But yeah, it's certainly, yeah, that's yeah, I don't really have more than that. That may be yeah.
All right, can we go to Adam? And then we'll finish up with Steve.
All right, so can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, just making sure. I do have a rather straightforward question, and it sort of follows along, if I have understood everyone correctly, at least an ancillary track is the questions that David and Travis were asking. And it has to do with your claim, as far as I understand it, a sort of Parfitian claim that moral status supervenes on a set of appropriate relations psychologically between oneself in the present and oneself in both the past and the future. And so I was imagining this case. I know that nothing like this is actually possible in the actual world, but I'm thinking here of a possible world where somebody would have something like a congenital fugue state, where, or you could think of it, I suppose, as congenital amnesia, where they're simply incapable of forming any kind of long-lasting, persisting self understanding or self-awareness. And I'm wondering, if it were the case that you had somebody who had a congenital fugue state, would that diminish my estimation of their moral status? And it's a tricky thing because my own view is that moral status is something we have by convention. It's not metaphysical, but taking along the Parfitian view, it seems like you need to have something there, some sort of psychological connectedness for there to be moral status. And yet, it seems to me like an individual who was born with a congenital fugue state would be an individual for whom we felt a duty of care as a community. We wouldn't think of them as someone, as Kirshner was saying, that we could, dispose of as we see fit. We would be thinking of them as someone that required care from the community in a particularly special way. And, and lastly, I'll just say, there's that great movie from the 80s by Woody Allen called Zelig, where the main character, Leonard Zelig, is somebody who is in a perpetual fugue state. Every time he walks into the room with a person, he takes on a completely different personal identity based on who's in the room with him. Like there's a scene where, he goes into a room full of rabbis and, grows long locks and starts talking about the Torah, et cetera. So you could imagine something like this happening. So I'm just curious what you would say about a case like that.
Well, the short answer is that I might say quite different things about different variants of the kind of case, because I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind by somebody in a congenital fugue state with no self-understanding, a Zelig-like person whose personality changes all the time. I did see that movie back when it came out, but I have no recollection of it whatsoever. I mean, so I'm kind of, yeah, I think everything depends on the details of the case, and I'm just not sure what kind of thing you have in mind. If there is some persistence of memory, or even if there are variations of character, but there's persistence of memory, persistence of belief, persistence of certain forms of knowledge, how to ride a bike or whatever, then there are psychological connections. But if it's a human being with really just kind of no moment-to-moment psychological continuity, even to the extent of there not being any kind of stable character or personality, I mean, I just don't know. Is this person capable of developing language and things like that? Then there are forms of continuity that matter. I mean, think about animals. They lack a lot. You might think they're in a kind of perpetual fugue state. Congenitally, they kind of recognize parts of their environment and so on, and have rudimentary memory capacity and that kind of thing. And the persistence of a stable but very minimal character. Yeah, I think they do have lower moral status. I don't think they're lacking in moral status. And so I'm inclined to say of your kind of person, we want to say that they're like you, that they're entitled to some kind of care from the community, partly because they do have some minimal form of moral status. On the other hand, I think part of the reason that we think that they are owed care from the community and that we need to treat them better than we treat stray animals or something is that they have human parents who care about them and love them, rightly so, and maybe siblings and so on. And so they come within the scope of these sort of agent relative concerns that all the rest of us need to respect, as well as having some kind of moral status.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, Steve Kirshner.
Yep, thanks for the talk again. So I kind of asked you what's wrong with, if we're going to focus on rights, and you said, okay, look, because fetuses don't have rights, there might not be anything wrong with killing them, but you said there might be something wrong with maiming them because of the rights of the future individual. And you seem to suggest, if I understood you correctly, that these rights are based on status. And I never really understood this.
I'm saying the rights are not so much based on status, they are, in a sense, constitutive of it, you might say. If we're, that is, you might, there are different analyses of what it is to have moral status. It may be that to have moral status just is to have rights, and that individuals that lack certain capacities that are necessary for having rights lack moral status, and that's the same thing as saying they lack rights.
But my concern is if that were the case, if status were constituted by rights rather than grounding rights, it's an odd view, because then we could ask, well, what grounds rights? I mean, imagine someone who's not going to have a life worth living, who's going to be both have negative desert during his life and have negative well-being. It doesn't seem that this person would have a right in not, if this was to an adult, that we shouldn't kill him because it's not going to promote his interest, when in fact it would promote his interest to kill him. He's not going to have a life worth living. He's going to have negative desert. And we can't use status because status is justified by interest. It doesn't seem that rights or status could be justified by autonomy, because if that's the case, then it's not clear how you could, what you would do with individuals who sort of lack autonomy altogether. You might say they have lesser rights, but then the question is what those rights would rest on. So I'm not sure if status is identical with rights. The question is what justifies rights. If status is what justifies rights, I think it's an odd thing to care about, because status is distinct from both an interest and autonomy. So I'm not sure why either approach is plausible. That is, viewing status as identical to rights or viewing status as justifying rights.
When I said that status might be equivalent to rights, what I didn't mean, what I would say is this. To have moral status is to be the kind of individual who matters for its own sake, his or her own sake. So that there are reasons to care about that individual that may be independent of that individual's interests, or may supplement those interests in certain ways, or may constitute constraints on the way that that individual can be treated. And one way of cashing out the notion of there being constraints on the way it's permissible to treat an individual, whether that individual can be used or sacrificed for others, is to say that that individual has rights. And if what we thought having moral status involved was coming within the scope of deontological constraints, having rights, those would be different ways of, or closely related ways of cashing out what it is to have moral status. I want to say that it is possible for an individual to have interests without having moral status. That's the example I gave of what I called an unconnected individual. In the book on the ethics of killing, I called it a sentient creature. You just imagine a kind of location for consciousness. So there is this brain or whatever that experiences states that are pleasurable or painful, attractive or aversive, but has no memory of the past and no conception of itself and no desires for the future, no beliefs about things. It's just a center for pleasure and pain. That's a being that I think has no moral status, no rights, constraints don't apply to it. It's replaceable, but it does have interests. I can harm it and I can benefit it. So I guess does that help to understand what I mean by moral status? And the point here is I claim a fetus with kind of minimal consciousness, just rudimentary consciousness and no psychological connections to the past or the future is an unconnected individual that lacks moral status. So I don't think it has rights. I don't think constraints apply to it and that kind of thing. Whatever the substantive content of having moral status might be.
So what you said is very interesting. I'll stop with this. But so what you said is, I asked you what justified rights, and you said, well, it's not status. Status is not a rights justifier. You said it's not interest because we have, old men who it's wrong to kill, even though they have lives that are not worth living. And so I guess my question is just kind of simple one. What on your account then justifies interest? I'm lacking. I'm not seeing the justifier. And the rights seem to be important because we kind of agree that we could describe what you should or shouldn't do to fetuses based on not on interest or the good, but on rights. So I guess my question is just straightforward. So in virtue of what does an individual have a right? And in virtue of what, let's say, there's a person have a right that's stronger than that of a pig.
Yeah, for me, the answer is a range of psychological capacities. Some degree of self-consciousness, some degree of rationality, some degree of autonomy, something like that. I'm inclined to think the best way to conceive of moral status is not as a single threshold, but as scalar or a matter of degree, so that the way I think we should probably cash out the notion of moral status is that it's possible for individuals to have higher moral status if their psychological capacities, a range of psychological capacities, are better developed. And what that means for me is that the constraints that govern their treatment, the deontological constraints that govern their treatment, are stronger. But deontological constraints and rights can vary in strength. Now, the problem with that view, which I don't have an answer to, is that it's incompatible with our current beliefs about human equality or the equality of persons. It's very difficult to say that there are variations in moral status until you reach a threshold of personhood, and then variations in the degree to which an individual possesses the psychological capacities that are themselves the foundations of moral status no longer matter. And there are problems here about what we should think about the possibility of aliens or genetically enhanced human beings whose psychological capacities might exceed ours to the same extent that our psychological capacities exceed those of the higher animals or of the lower animals. Would they have higher status? Would we be potentially sacrificable for them? And so on. And I just don't know the answers to those questions, but my inclination is to think that something like this, that a range of psychological capacities are the foundation of moral status. That's what brings an individual within the scope of certain constraints that limit, what may be done to them in pursuit of the best consequences for others, and that these psychological capacities vary in degree, and in principle, moral status varies with the development of the psychological capacities. That is, constraints are stronger, the higher or stronger the psychological capacities are, but that for various pragmatic and political reasons, we have to have these thresholds that say that all the individuals above a certain threshold are equal, for political purposes and so on.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, well, that concludes our Q&A. Let's thank our speaker yet again.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good talk. Feel free to stick around. I'm going to stop